starting off with just a reminder that whether it's cross-border or domestic, e-commerce is business. We do have a tendency to think that different rules apply to e-commerce, and to some extent there are different things that apply, but the reality is whatever applies to running a business applies to running an e-commerce focused one. So what are we going to look at today? We're going to cover domestic versus cross-border e-commerce, things to do before going cross-border, the advantages of cross-border e-commerce, and conversely, the challenges and risks of cross-border e-commerce. And finally today, we're going to touch on some ideas to get you going if you haven't yet embarked on your e-commerce journey, or indeed to get you thinking about some different ideas if you have already started but you're looking at expanding. So starting off with domestic versus cross-border e-commerce. Now this might seem like a bit of a no-brainer, but I do think that it begs pointing out. So domestic trade, of course, is the exchange of domestic goods within the boundaries of a single country. Domestic trade can be subdivided into two categories, wholesale or retail. So you're either selling B2B or you're selling B2C. Domestic e-commerce is online trade, but within the same borders of that same one country. Cross-border trade is something that happens between different countries or involving people or businesses from different countries. Cross-border e-commerce is international online trade. Now, when we focus on e-commerce and we look at the differences between domestic and cross-border, at its simplest, cross-border e-commerce is a lot more complicated than domestic because it has a number of different layers to it. Just as if you have a bricks and mortar shop and you are simply selling to people who walk in and out of your shop door, that is one level of business. But if you take the same goods and you package them and you sell them overseas via the more traditional trade channels, it becomes a lot more complicated. Similarly, domestic versus cross-border e-commerce has that similar complexity difference between the two. So if we pause and look at just a few of the areas, these will get you thinking about others that you might have to consider. So first of all, the area of operation. Of course, domestic e-commerce is within the borders of one country, so the area of operation is essentially one. It's one country. Cross-border e-commerce focuses on many different countries, many different markets. Standards. So when we're talking about standards, we're talking about things like certification of products, complying with certain standards, etc. If you are selling just within the borders of Australia, of course, you only have to comply with Australia's rules and Australia's standards, Australia's certification, etc. If, however, you are selling outside of Australia, it is magnified by the number of countries into which you are selling. And yes, even if you are selling B2C, you still need to comply. Currency, well, if you're selling in Australia, it's the Australian dollar and you don't have to think any further than that. If you're selling cross-border, you have to take into account the currencies of every market into which you are selling. And even if you are pricing in the Australian dollar, you still have to take into account currency fluctuations because the way that people perceive the pricing of your product is going to change depending on their own currency. Regulations, of course, here again, one set of regulations as they apply in Australia, and that includes things like business licensing, taxation, etc. When you start selling into those other markets, there are many sets of regulations. Every single country into which you are selling has its own regulations. And of course, you still have to comply with Australian regulations as well. And that includes things like export permits for certain ranges of goods, certain classes of goods. Complying with customs regulations, both within Australia before you leave and those on the other side of the equation when your goods arrive in the country to which you are exporting them. And yes, e-commerce is still export. Paperwork, relatively limited in Australia. We all know what we need to do here in terms of filing tax returns, etc. But when you start thinking about paperwork that is involved when you are sending goods offshore, you have a whole raft of other things that become involved, and it gets very complicated very quickly. So in addition to having to comply in Australia, you also have to think about the paperwork that you might have to file if you are setting up or selling into a country like China or the United States, for example. You also have to think about all the layers of paperwork simply from an export perspective. Shipping. When you ship domestically, you have many options, many different modes of transport. At its simplest, you might be able to take the goods, put them in the back of your motor car, and drive them to a suburb on the other side of the city. You can put them on a rail link. You can put them, obviously, on a domestic aircraft. Shipping, not so much within Australia because we don't have internal shipping lanes, but there are many modes of transport. When you're shipping internationally, your modes of transport are a lot more limited in terms of getting from Australia into another country. It's basically sea and air. And sea you're only going to use when you are selling B2B and you are selling in bulk. Your customers, when you're selling domestically, your customers are pretty homogenous. They're all within this country, and it's relatively easy to understand who they are and where they fit in. When you start selling overseas, you're selling to many different customers in many different countries. They all have their own characteristics, their own cultures, their own likes, their own dislikes. So you go from homogenous to heterogeneous, which becomes a lot more complicated. Marketing, of course, is relatively simple insofar as marketing is ever simple, but it is relatively simple when you're selling within one country. It becomes a lot more complicated and a lot more complex when you are trying to deal with marketing in a number of different markets where different channels work in different markets. People look for different things. They react differently to advertising and promotions, etc. Market research, well, that's relatively simple when you're doing it in Australia. A lot of it you can do physically. You can walk around, you can look at what the competition is doing, and you can get a clear sense of what is happening in Australia relatively easily. However, it becomes a lot more complicated when you are dealing with overseas markets, particularly at the moment where international travel is curtailed. You can't just hop on an aeroplane and walk the streets of Tokyo to get a sense of what people are wearing, etc. You have to do your research from a desk perspective, and that can become quite complicated. Of course, it is less expensive now than it once was. Of course, when we start looking at growth potential, your domestic growth is limited because it's limited by the population and the demographic in this one single country. However, your growth potential when you start looking at cross-border e-commerce is enormous. In fact, it's exponential. It really is only limited by your imagination to a large extent. And that is why cross-border e-commerce makes a great deal of sense. But there are some things that you have to do before you think of going cross-border. Now, if you've not ever sent anything offshore, of course, the basics apply, and you have to understand the basics of doing business internationally. But very importantly, you have to do your homework. So irrespective of how experienced a business person you are, or how experienced indeed an exporter you are, every time you start thinking of going into a different market, you have to redo all of this stuff. You've got to do your homework because you have to understand your customer, you have to understand your market, and you have to do that for every market that you enter. You have to understand your promotion and advertising options. So what can you do within that market? What do you have to do within that market? Essentially, you have to become a master in each of your target markets. You have to get your pricing right. If you price your items too high, they won't sell. If you sell them too low, you won't make a profit. And indeed, you might devalue them in the eyes of your potential customers if you're not selling them at high enough a price. If your competitors are selling the same or a similar product, how are you going to compete? Are you going to compete by selling at a lower price? And if you do, will you still make a profit? Are you going to price higher and put yourself into a different bracket and essentially position yourself as premium? Can you afford to do that? And will the market sustain that? You've got to create a shipping policy. That means you have to make it clear to your customers what the shipping options are. Can they pay more for faster delivery? And bear in mind that we are living in a time where we have limited capacity on aircraft simply because we have fewer international flights leaving Australia because there are fewer coming into Australia. So some of those rules around what you can offer your customers to a large extent have been taken out of your hands. You might want to think about working with more than one carrier. If you limit yourself to working with one carrier, the delivery options you can offer your customers are limited too. Local or regional carriers might be able to offer you better rates. So if you are shipping to China, a carrier that is actually Chinese and based in China but has an office in Australia might be a better option than working with a purely Australian carrier. You need to do your research again, and you need to pick your carriers based on their price, absolutely. Also, their speed of delivery, their tracking options. How well do they allow you and your customers to keep track of the goods? Their reputation, their options for integration. So will they integrate with your systems and processes, with your warehouse management software, with your client relationship management software, for example? And what is the variety of services that they offer? There is not a one-size-fits-all option here. You have to choose the one that makes sense for you, your business, your customers, and all of your requirements. You're also going to have to choose a fulfillment partner. So it can be beneficial to work with a fulfillment partner that's based in the country that you are going to be selling into. It can lead to potentially lower transport costs, faster, cheaper delivery for your customers. But again, that has to be a business decision. And again, if you are outsourcing to a fulfillment partner and that fulfillment partner is not within your own country, it becomes a little bit more difficult to control the relationship. The risk factor goes up when somebody is not geographically close to you. And finally, you have to determine your returns policy. It's very important that you understand what your returns policy is and why, and you need to communicate that to your customers. If you haven't appropriately handled your returns policy, you will find that you could very quickly start eroding your profit margin. In certain markets, returns are an absolute part of the e-commerce transaction. People will always buy more knowing that they are going to return the majority of what they buy. You need to be aware of that, and you need to have a policy that accommodates that or does not allow it. Be sure that your returns policy is very clearly stated on your website, and do everything you can to limit the reasons people can return your product. Of course, there are many reasons why people will return and why they have to return and you cannot refuse. And that is if you ship the wrong item in the first place. The customer might have made a mistake in what they ordered. They might have ordered 2 instead of 1 because they accidentally pressed the same button twice. It would be very difficult for you not to take back the second item under the law. If goods are damaged in transit, well, obviously, and if goods are faulty, etc., you have no choice but to take them back. Also, make sure that whatever your returns policy is, it doesn't contravene the regulations and the liability protection for your consumers in the market into which you are selling. You might find that you have a certain returns policy, but that returns policy goes against consumer law in the market into which you're selling, and that consumer law will override your returns policy. Understand that and understand how that could affect your bottom line. So very, very important to understand. And then, of course, understand how you are going to get the goods back. How are your customers returning those goods? Have you got a relationship with a carrier that also deals with reverse shipping? Or is it left up to the customer to do that by themselves? That could hamper your relationship with your customer and might do you some disservice from a promotion and a marketing side. Now, having looked at all the things that you need to take into account before you embark on this journey or before you move into new markets, let's look at some of the advantages of cross-border e-commerce. So why do you want to do this? Well, first of all, if you do this, you expand your business outside of Australia. And very often your home market is saturated. If your home market is saturated, you've already sold to every customer potentially that you can do. The only way that you can expand your business is to tap into new markets. Selling internationally also gives you the opportunity to seize the potential of different product ranges compared to the domestic market. And once you've broken those product ranges into those markets, you might then want to consider selling them into Australia and expanding that saturated market, which suddenly is not that saturated to you anymore. It enables diversification. Now, the one thing that has snapped into focus over the last 18 or so months under COVID is that diversification is key. Diversification of markets, diversification of supply chain. Where you get your goods from and where you sell your goods into has to be diverse. The more diverse it is, the more you move your risk and the better it is for you to build a sustainable business. If you sell into only one market and that one market fails, you have lost your business. Every time you sell into more markets, you can weather storms. If you lose one, there are others that can help you pick up the slack. And yes, the risk does increase across those markets as well. But when you weigh up the risks and the benefits, particularly when you are selling online, the benefits almost always outweigh the risks. The risks that are associated with being active in just one domestic market are many. Because as I said, if you lose that one, you've lost your business. So this helps you to reduce that risk. And of course, it increases your revenue. The more you sell, the better your margins can be and the better your profit. Now, some of those particular advantages and looking in a little bit more detail. International expansion. The internet provides a borderless world. It gives you the opportunity to expand internationally with far less effort than setting up a local operation in that country would require from you. So if you were expanding your bricks and mortar operation into another market, it becomes incredibly complicated. It takes a really long time, and there are many, many layers of regulation, etc., to which you have to comply. Selling online is a lot simpler and a lot easier. Increased revenue. The more customers you have, the more markets you have, the more sales you make, and the more revenue you generate. You, of course, have bigger markets. The biggest benefit that cross-border e-commerce brings is a substantial increase in the number of people you can sell to. Australia is a very small market in terms of world market size. It is easily saturated. The rest of the world is massive, even if you are not selling into the biggest e-commerce markets. Of course, it's new and exciting. If you break into a new market, it gives you the chance to renew what you do and to excite yourself again as you excite a new audience. It allows you to expand your range, to come up with new ideas, fresh ideas, and that reinvigorates your entire business. What you sell in those cross-border e-commerce markets will have a knock-on effect on your local business and will lift its game. Of course, when you sell cross-border, you don't have to be alone. You can delegate many of the tasks that are required for successful cross-border e-commerce to shipping agents, freight forwarders, other logistics-focused entities, and that gives you more time to focus on your core business. If you are operating a bricks and mortar operation in Australia, a lot of your energy goes into just keeping that door physically open. When you're selling offshore and you are using others to help grow your business, a lot of that effort is taken from you and you can concentrate on growing your business and growing your product range. Now, there are many advantages, and we've touched on just some of those today, but of course, the scales balance. So just as there are advantages, there are challenges and there are risks associated with cross-border e-commerce. So the first challenge is market selection. So which markets offer reasonable chances of success? And not just success, but success within a reasonable time frame. You have to be circumspect when it comes to selecting your market and understand that often the obvious choices, so the largest e-commerce markets like China and the United States, are not the only options. The true potential, particularly for smaller businesses, can very often be in smaller and emerging markets. You need to look not just at the size of the market into which you are selling potentially, but also the growth potential in that market and the appetite for the goods that you are selling. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. If you're going to choose the right market, you should be profiling that market properly in order to determine the potential, not just overall in that market, but for your product, your brand, and your market segment. How do your prices compare? Where will you fit in? Are you going to be seen as a premium product, which means you will sell less, but at a higher price? Or are you going to enter the market at the lowest level where you have to be looking at volume so that you can increase turnover in order to increase margin? How much does it cost to advertise in that market? And indeed, do you have the right skills to advertise in that market? If you have particular speciality in, let's say, for example, Facebook advertising, and you're selling into a market like China, those skills are not going to help you because you cannot advertise on Facebook. It just isn't there. You have to find a way to advertise and to promote on a social medium that works in that country. And so it is for every other country in the world. It's very important that you understand your limitations in that market. Just as your home market is saturated, and that's why you are choosing to expand, you have to understand that the world is a very crowded place. Here, your competition is relatively limited. When you start selling cross-border, your competition is the entire world, and that is something that you cannot take lightly. You also have no home country advantage when you are selling cross-border. That means you have to establish your brand all over again, and you have to get to know your customers all over again and build new relationships with them. Of course, language can be an issue, and that is not just the language of English versus another language, but it also comes down to translating your assets. It comes down to cultural issues, etc. So for most sellers from Australia, selling abroad means translating your website. You might choose to offer a uniform.com version of your online site in English. Many people do. Certainly the big international brands do that. But if you're a smaller player, you might have to translate until you are established. And that means translating your online shop, your product descriptions, any marketing materials, any terms of use, etc., into multiple languages. You might decide that instead of doing that and having your website accessible to everyone in the world, you want to geo-block it and you want to make it available to only certain markets, which you certainly can do as well, particularly until you're established, and then you might open some more markets. So that is always an option as well. One of the major stumbling blocks of cross-border e-commerce is shipping. It's how to get the products to your new customers on time, in good condition, and without you spending too much money on shipping or without you passing exorbitant shipping costs on to them. So just recently, I had a conversation, was doing some mentoring with a small business that produces pearls in the Cook Islands. Most beautiful pearls, sold at actually remarkably low prices for what they are. They attempted to sell via e-commerce and then discovered that it was impossible because of the shipping rates. So if they were selling a really beautiful Tahitian pearl and that pearl was retailing at around $500, shipping would add another $120 to the price of that item, which made it unaffordable. So those are things that you have to think about. Supply chain inefficiencies, of course, can also lead to all sorts of problems, including late deliveries, excessive return rates, increased logistic costs, reduced profit margins, etc. So you have to understand how that can affect your business and particularly your profit margin. And then, of course, there's the good old-fashioned customs compliance. Now, the word customs is often enough to send shivers down the spine of many businesses. Every country has its own specific rules and regulations when it comes to importing goods from overseas. And when you are exporting from Australia, your customer on the other end of the equation is an importer, even if you are selling B2C, and there are rules and regulations, and you have to understand what they are to understand how to deal with your market there. That means, again, you'd have to do your homework. Freight forwarders, of course, are experts at negotiating the ins and outs of customs rules and regulations, and that's why you probably want to engage a forwarder to manage your shipping activity. Now, just as there are challenges, there are risks, and these are things that at the very least you need to take cognizance of. Operational risks, bad return on investment because you had an inflexible business model. When you sell into a new market, there's always investment involved. In order to become profitable within a reasonable amount of time, you have to take a number of different measures, including the localization of your website, etc., streamlining logistics processes, returns, etc. If you underestimated any of those components, you could find that the return on your investment by going into that new market is not going to be returned. It's not going to be high enough. Financial risk. Of course, there's always the risk of fraud. When you are selling online internationally, fraud is a very real factor, and it can cost you a lot of money. It can cost you goods because you lose the goods. Chargebacks of fraudulent transactions are expensive. Missed revenues from genuine orders blocked by fraud detection software. The money spent on fraud protection in general. Fraud prevention, very, very important, but of course it shouldn't exceed the cost of the fraud itself. And where possible, make sure that you have appropriate insurance. And the final risk that I'd like to touch on is legal risk. And this is also a very real one. Understand, different rules, different regulations, different potential fines. So legal differences can constitute a high risk for online retailers at various levels. On the one hand, of course, it's costly, it's undesirable to deal with the authorities because you haven't complied with something. You don't want to get in trouble with the law ever, particularly not in another country. On the other hand, some governments apply strict fines when online shops don't comply with local rules. So, for example, in Germany, if you don't meet the legal terms and conditions and you don't have them appropriately displayed on your website, anybody can hire a lawyer and have warnings sent to the operator of the site, and those warnings can lead to fines. Many different regimes of consumer protection are also in place, so you have to understand what your rules are under the law of that country in terms of pre-contractual, contractual, and post-contractual phases. And every time someone buys something from you, they are indeed entering into a contract of sale. even if you are working B2C. And that, of course, is the same in your bricks and mortar shop. If you are selling something over a counter and you give somebody a receipt at the end of the day, that constitutes the proof that the contract has been honored. So bear that in mind. Now, we've talked about challenges, we've talked about risks, we've talked about opportunities, and certainly we've talked about some of the benefits of selling cross-border. Let's look now, in the time that's left to us in this afternoon's session, at some ideas that you might want to think about if you're looking at expanding either your brick and mortar business into e-commerce and you're looking at cross-border, or you're looking at expanding your cross-border market. Now, I just draw your attention. You've seen this one before. This is the size of the opportunity. These are the 10 largest e-commerce markets. The largest of them is China, followed by the United States. And you can see all the others in the 10 scattered around there. And as I mentioned at the start of today's webinar, also bear in mind that it's not just the size of the market, it's the growth potential. So China is the biggest. India is the fastest growing, for example, and every market has its own vagaries in terms of size and how quickly it's growing and how much it still can grow. So a few e-commerce business ideas based on the following: demand, market saturation, difficulty of execution, so just how easy is this to do, and potential growth. So you might want to think, for example, about creating a niche apparel product, so something that is wearable. You can create an e-commerce website to sell niche custom-made apparel products such as branded merchandise or slogan t-shirts. The market indicates that people love this stuff, and you don't even need to invest in inventory up front because you can use print-on-demand services like Printify to drop ship t-shirts, sweatshirts, hoodies, socks, pretty much anything that you can print and that people can wear. Also, think about selling industrial B2B products because there's very little competition. And this might seem bizarre, but many people, when they first start thinking about selling cross-border e-commerce, they think B2C. But businesses are ready to buy online, but many suppliers just haven't yet cottoned on, which means that there is still first mover advantage to be had. So that is certainly something to think about. Do what Amazon can't. So what do we mean by that? Well, we mean that you need to offer your potential customers something that Amazon can't, which is a personalized, high-quality selection of niche products. So if you're not selling through a platform and you're going to sell direct, look at what is not already available on the big platforms. And Amazon is just an example here. We could have replaced that with eBay or Alibaba. Sell something that's trending. How do you know what's trending? Well, you go to Google Trends. There is such a thing if you hadn't already heard of it. You go to Google Trends, you put in a keyword, you pick a time frame, and it comes up with results that you can analyze. And that means you can capitalize on current market trends. Now, current market trends are just that. What is really popular and selling really well today might not be a month from now or 2 months or 3 months from now. So you have to be constantly changing what you do to stay ahead of the curve. But that is certainly one way to start getting a toehold. Handmade goods are really big. Consider listing your maker items for sale. Consumers are placing an increasingly high value on handmade goods as people start moving away from consumerism and from global uniform products. They are looking for those specific handmade items. Etsy's gross merchandise sales have grown to more than $5 billion, and they're a really good proxy for the rising interest. Etsy is also a really good platform on which you can sell your homemade, handmade goods. Think about drop shipping. This is a method of selling products without actually stocking them. So you sign up with a manufacturer who will supply the goods to your customers after they buy them from your e-commerce site. So why would you think about drop shipping? The startup costs are a lot lower. Dropshipping reduces the costs of launching an online business because you don't have to invest in inventory upfront. And of course, you can have a really large product range. You can offer a much wider range of product than if you were selling them from your own manufacturer. And that means you can jump on new trends really quickly. And those ideas hopefully have sparked some interest in you and have got you thinking about some of the things you can do. There are other things that are selling really well online, like toys, for example, products aimed at children, particularly children's clothing, etc. So the sky really is the limit. I hope that today's session has given you some food for thought. It's made you think of expanding your domestic e-commerce market to an international cross-border one, and some of those different business ideas, if you haven't already come up with ideas of your own because you're only just thinking about going into new markets. Of course, there's also a whole world of selling services. You might be selling ebooks, for example, or courses, and there are many, many ways in which you can deal with the current need for education online, for example, if you want to look at selling something like that.